I bought a cheap storage unit from an online auction, but after 2 weeks I realized someone was still visiting it at night, leaving things behind that proved the unit had never been abandoned. I thought I had won the easiest auction of my life. 2 weeks later, I realized I had bought a storage unit that was never actually empty. The whole thing started because I was bored, broke, and dangerously confident in my ability to spot a bargain. I had been scrolling through online storage auctions for about a month, mostly out of curiosity at first, then because I actually started thinking I could make money from them. You see these videos where people buy abandoned units for a few $100s and find furniture, tools, electronics, sometimes boxes of stuff they can resell. It looks simple when somebody else is doing it. You tell yourself you just need a little patience, a decent eye, and the willingness to deal with dust. I had none of those things, really, but I did have a laptop, a bank account that looked slightly insulting, and way too much time on my hands. The unit I won was listed at a facility about 40 minutes outside my city. The photos were terrible, which was actually part of what made it interesting. The auction page showed a wide shot of a metal roll-up door, half open with a few mismatched boxes near the entrance, a broken office chair, and what looked like a cheap bookshelf tipped on its side. No close-ups, no detailed inventory, just enough to suggest that the previous renter had left in a hurry or stopped paying and never came back. The description was vague in that specific way these auctions always are. Contents unknown, buyer responsible for removal, unit must be cleaned out within 72 hours. That was it. I bid a little higher than I probably should have, mostly because I had convinced myself I was seeing hidden value. If the boxes contained books, clothes, maybe kitchen stuff, I could probably flip enough of it to at least cover my bid. If I found anything good, that would be a bonus. There was also this stupid little voice in the back of my head telling me that a cheap unit was better than gambling on a more expensive one. That way, even if I got junk, I hadn't really lost much. I won it for $180. At the time, I remember feeling proud of that number, like I had outsmarted the system. The facility manager handed me the lock code the next morning, and I drove out there with a borrowed truck and the kind of mood that makes you feel like a future success story. I expected disappointment. I was prepared for disappointment, but even disappointment has a shape, and this place had the wrong shape from the second I walked up to it. The unit door was already slightly open. Not wide open, just enough that I could tell someone had left it hanging loose, maybe an inch or two off the floor. I paused before touching it, because for one weird second, I thought maybe the staff had already inspected it or accidentally forgotten to close it all the way. But the lock had been cut clean and replaced with the facility's temporary tag, which meant this was officially open for pickup. So I pulled the door up. The unit smelled like dust, old cardboard, and something vaguely damp. Nothing unusual. The contents were exactly what I had expected. A few boxes, a broken chair, a narrow shelving unit, a folded rug, a plastic bin full of tangled cables, and a cheap mirror with one corner cracked off. There was also a mattress leaned against the back wall, standing upright in a way that made the space look somehow more abandoned than empty. I spent the next hour sorting through everything by hand. Most of it was junk, a pile of paperback novels with bent covers, cheap dishes, a bread maker missing its cord, old clothes in garbage bags, a box of Christmas decorations that smelled like mildew. There were a few useful things, but nothing dramatic. I found a decent lamp, a set of drawer organizers, and a barely working office chair that I figured I could clean up and sell for $20. By the time I finished loading the truck, I felt a little stupid for being excited in the first place. I had probably broken even if I was lucky, maybe made a small profit if I put in the effort. Nothing life-changing, nothing worth bragging about. Still, I was oddly pleased with myself for the rest of the day. What I didn't know then was that the unit had already given me the first warning. It was a small thing. At the back of the shelf behind a stack of empty folders, I found a ceramic mug with a hairline crack running down the side. It had a faded blue floral pattern and a chipped rim. That by itself wasn't strange. People leave mugs in storage all the time, but when I picked it up it was warm. Not hot, not even close, just warm enough that my fingers noticed it immediately. I assumed the sun had heated it through the metal door, because the unit had been sitting in direct afternoon light. I put it in the truck and forgot about it. The next day I sold a few items online and got on with my life. For about 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then I got a notification from the auction site that made my stomach tighten for no obvious reason. It was a generic message asking whether I had completed removal from the unit and would be leaving feedback on the process. I almost ignored it, but the message had a timestamp and a location tag attached to the facility, and when I opened it, I noticed something that made me sit up straighter. It said the unit had been accessed overnight. Not by me, not by staff during office hours. By someone at 2:13 a.m. At first I thought it had to be a system error. Maybe they had scanned the unit wrong. Maybe a worker had checked it late and the software flagged it as overnight access. But the facility was small, privately run, and the manager was the kind of guy who treated every transaction like a minor inconvenience. He wouldn't be sneaking around after midnight. I called the office the next morning and asked about it casually, trying not to sound weird. The manager sounded confused. He checked the log and told me the unit had definitely been opened after hours. He said the access code had been used at the gate, then the unit had been unlocked, and then closed again roughly 20 minutes later. I remember asking him, by who? He answered, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Then he asked if I had authorized anyone to go back in. I said no. He told me he'd look into it. I hung up feeling annoyed more than alarmed. My first thought was that someone had made a mistake with the entry code. My second thought was that maybe this was related to another unit and the system had glitched. But when I checked the security photos attached to the facility app, my annoyance turned into a cold, buzzing kind of attention I can only describe as immediate dread. There was a blur at the edge of the frame. Not enough to identify a face clearly, but enough to tell it was a person. A person in a dark hoodie, standing just outside the unit with something in their hand. The timestamp was 2:13 a.m. The image quality was awful, but the posture looked familiar in a way that made my stomach drop before I understood why. The person was holding their head slightly down and to the side, like they were trying not to be seen by a camera they already knew about. That should have been the end of it right there, because no normal person sneaks into an auction unit after midnight unless they have a reason. But I still hadn't connected it to me. I figured maybe somebody had left behind property they were trying to recover, or maybe a former renter had gotten into the facility through a copied access code. That seemed far more likely than anything else. Then I found the second mug. It was in the back of my truck. I know how insane that sounds, but I'm telling you exactly how it happened. I had cleaned out the truck bed when I got home from the auction because I hated clutter, and I had swept out the dust and debris before loading anything in. There was no mug there. I would have seen it. But 2 weeks later, when I was unloading some of the items I hadn't listed yet, I found the same blue floral mug sitting inside one of the stacked storage bins. I stared at it for a full minute before picking it up. This time it was cold, but inside it was not empty. There was a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the lip, sealed in a tiny plastic bag to protect it from moisture. The paper was wrinkled from being folded and unfolded repeatedly, and when I opened it, I saw writing so cramped and uneven that it looked like somebody had been trying to write in a hurry with shaking hands. Only one sentence. You should not have taken the box. I didn't move for a few seconds. I just stood there in my garage, holding that note, trying to make sense of a sentence that seemed both impossible and completely personal at the same time. Because I had no idea what box it was talking about. I went through the items from the storage unit again that night. I emptied every bin, checked every pocket, every drawer, every bag. I started to wonder if somebody had planted the note as a prank, but that made no sense. Who would prank a random stranger by secretly entering a storage facility in the middle of the night? Then I found the box. It was one of the plain brown ones I had stacked in the corner because it had been too boring to sort through on day one. I had assumed it contained linens or old paperwork. Instead, when I opened it, I found a set of photo albums, a handful of keys, and a small wrapped bundle tied with kitchen string. The bundle contained 3 things: a cheap digital recorder, a keycard from the storage facility, and a second note. This one said, "He still comes back, don't stay after dark." By then I knew I was in something much stranger than a forgotten storage unit. The problem was, I still didn't know whether the warning was for me or about me. I checked the box 3 times before I touched the recorder. It was one of those cheap little handheld devices people use for lectures or interviews, the kind with a cracked plastic screen and a record button that had been worn smooth by use. There was no label on it, no tape, no obvious clue about who had owned it, but the fact that it was hidden inside the storage unit with a facility keycard and a warning note made it feel less like junk and more like evidence. I set everything on my kitchen table and just stared at it for a while. The keycard was the part that bothered me most, not because it was unusual by itself, but because it meant someone had access to the facility beyond what I'd been given. Either they had kept a spare, stolen one, or worked there at some point. I kept turning it over in my hand, reading the faded numbers again and again like they would change if I looked long enough. I told myself not to panic. There were explanations. Weird explanations, sure, but explanations. Maybe the previous renter had left behind some personal stash, and another person was secretly trying to recover it. Maybe this was some kind of abandoned relationship drama where 2 people had split badly and one of them knew about the unit. Maybe the facility had hired someone sloppy and they'd been sneaking in to retrieve forgotten items without reporting them. That was my rational brain talking. The less rational part of me was already sure this was personal. I looked through the photo albums first. They were old, the kind with thick cardboard pages and sticky plastic overlays that had yellowed at the corners. Most of the pictures were of a family I didn't recognize. A man in his 40s with a graying beard, a woman with short hair and a tired smile, 2 kids, maybe 6 and 8 in the earliest photos, then older in the later ones. Birthday parties, backyard barbecues, a late trip. a Christmas tree in a tiny living room with a broken ornament hanging low on one side. Normal life stuff. Then I found the first photo that didn't belong. It had been slid into the back of the album, hidden behind a page of school pictures. The photo showed the storage unit itself, but from the inside before it had been emptied, the same shelf, the same mattress, the same cracked mirror. And standing in the center of the frame was the person who had left the notes. Their face was partially blurred by motion, but the clothes were clear. Dark hoodie, dark jeans, one hand in their pocket, the other holding what looked like a flashlight or maybe a small camera. That was bad enough, but what made my skin go cold was the date written on the back. 3 days before I had even bought the unit. So whoever had been visiting at night hadn't started after I took ownership. They had been doing it before. I spent the next hour flipping through the albums more carefully, checking the handwritten dates, comparing names, trying to figure out if the family in the pictures matched anyone I knew. Nothing. It all felt unrelated until I reached a page with a set of graduation photos and a group shot from a front porch. At the bottom of the page, written in blue ink, was a name. Ethan. That was also the name on the note hidden in the plastic bag, the one under the mug. Not a full signature, just a first name and a date. I sat back in my chair and tried to remember whether I had seen an Ethan anywhere in the auction listing. Maybe in the seller's notes, maybe in the facility records, maybe in some little detail I'd missed. I hadn't. I decided to call the facility again. This time I asked them if the unit had belonged to anyone named Ethan. There was a long silence on the other end. Then the manager said, "Why are you asking?" That was the wrong answer. It wasn't a no. It wasn't confusion. It was cautious, like he already knew what I was talking about and was deciding how much to admit. I told him I'd found personal items in the unit. He asked what kind. I said photo albums, keys, a recorder, some notes. He said he'd call me back. He didn't. So I drove out there the next morning. The facility was one of those low-budget places with chain-link fencing, concrete lanes, and a tiny office building with mirrored windows. It looked empty except for a white sedan parked near the office and a man unloading something from a van 2 rows down. The whole place had that washed-out, overlit look that makes everything feel exposed. When I walked into the office, the manager recognized me immediately and looked annoyed in the way people do when they want to pretend they are alarmed. I asked him straight out if he knew anything about the unit. He said no. I asked him again, this time slower, and told him I had found a photo of the storage unit taken before I bought it, which meant someone had been entering it earlier. His expression changed. He didn't look surprised, he looked tired. Then he asked me to sit down. He pulled a small notebook from under the counter and asked me to describe exactly what I found. I listed everything, the recorder, the keycard, the notes, the albums. When I said Ethan, he shut the notebook and rubbed his face with both hands. That's when he finally admitted the unit had a history. Not a clean one either. According to him, the unit had belonged to a man named Ethan Vale, who'd rented there for just over a year before falling behind on payments. There had been repeated attempts to contact him, but after a while they stopped getting responses. Eventually the account went delinquent, the unit was processed, and the auction went up like any other abandoned property. He told me that a woman had called a few times asking about the unit after it was listed, but she had never given a full explanation of who she was. She just asked whether the unit contents had been photographed and whether anything personal had been removed. The facility had told her no, because they didn't know what she was talking about. I asked why he hadn't mentioned any of this when I bought it. He looked genuinely embarrassed and said, because we didn't think it mattered, it was just another delinquent unit. That answer made me want to punch a wall, but I stayed seated. Then I asked the question that had been forming in my head since the night before. Who has the access card? He went still. Then he said no one should. That was almost funny, in a miserable way. I told him someone had used it at 2:13 a.m. and the system had logged the entry. He swallowed hard and said he'd check the back office cameras. I stood in the doorway while he disappeared into a room behind the counter. He came back 10 minutes later with a tablet in his hands and a face that had lost whatever color it had before. He turned the screen toward me and pointed. The footage showed the front gate opening just after 2 a.m. A figure entered on foot, hood up, hands in pockets, moving with the confidence of someone who knew the layout. They crossed the lot without hesitation and went straight to my unit. Not hesitated once. Not looked around. Not acted like a thief. Like somebody returning to a place they already knew. I asked if he could zoom in. He said the camera quality was too bad. I said, "Can you tell who it is?" He hesitated. Then he said, "I think it might be the woman who called." That caught me off guard. How? He explained that when she had come to the office a week earlier, she'd worn the same kind of hoodie, and the build looked similar. He also said she had asked too many questions about when the unit would be opened, what time staff were on site, and whether buyers were allowed to inspect units after dark. That last part chilled me more than anything else, because it meant she had been checking for a window. Not for me. For herself. I asked for her name. He said he didn't have it. I told him that was ridiculous, and he knew it. He said he only had the phone number she called from, and he wrote it on a sticky note and handed it over. He also gave me the auction file, or at least the parts he was willing to print without his manager yelling at him later. The file contained the delinquency notice, the auction date, and the contact info they had on record for Ethan. There was one address. It was 40 minutes from the facility. I drove there immediately. The address led to a small one-story house in a neighborhood that looked like it had been forgotten by everyone except the people living there. Neat but worn, old vehicles in driveways, a chain-link fence leaning slightly at the corner. It was the kind of place where you can tell people have learned to mind their own business. I sat in my truck for almost 10 minutes before I got out. I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe no one home, maybe an old relative, maybe a rental house with nothing useful left behind. But when I walked up and knocked, a woman answered almost immediately, like she had been standing on the other side of the door waiting for a sound. She was in her 50s, maybe early 60s, with tired eyes and the kind of posture that comes from years of bracing for bad news. She looked at me, then at the folder in my hand, and her face tightened. I said I had bought Ethan's storage unit. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, "So it's gone." I asked who she was. She said she was Ethan's mother. That answered some things and raised 100 more. She invited me inside, not warmly, but with the exhausted politeness of someone who had already crossed the point of pretending everything was fine. The house was quiet and tidy, too tidy. The living room looked arranged more for keeping order than for comfort. There were framed photos on the wall, most of them of Ethan at different ages. School pictures, sports pictures, one graduation photo, one military-style portrait I couldn't place. I laid the folder on the table and told her what I had found. The albums, the notes, the recorder, the keycard. When I mentioned the night visits, she closed her eyes. Then she said, "He told me he'd come back for it." I asked who. She said, "My son." There was a long pause after that. Then she explained that Ethan had not simply abandoned the unit. He had stopped speaking to the family after something happened almost a year earlier. She wouldn't go into every detail right away, only that he had left home suddenly, taken a room across town, and started keeping strange hours. According to her, he had become obsessive about storing things away, locking things up, and recording conversations. She kept calling him paranoid. He kept saying he was being careful. Then one night he vanished from his apartment, leaving behind most of his belongings but not the storage unit. That was the part she kept trying to emphasize. The unit itself mattered to him. He had told her it held the parts that can't be left at home. I asked her what that meant. She said she didn't know. But her face said she knew more than she wanted to admit. I asked about the woman from the facility. She went still again. Then she said that was his sister. I didn't say anything for a second. His sister. That explained the secrecy, the late-night visits, the note, the keycard, the way the facility manager had looked like he wanted to crawl out of his own skin. But it also made the whole thing worse, because now this wasn't just a forgotten storage unit or some random break-in. This was family. Messy, private, probably ugly family history, the kind that leaves people guarding boxes like they contain a second life. Ethan's mother watched my face and realized I was waiting for an explanation. She sat down slowly and told me her daughter's name was Mara. Ethan and Mara had not spoken much in the last year, but she believed Mara had been trying to find whatever Ethan had hidden in the unit before the auction. Not to steal it, to stop it from being sold. I asked, "Stop what exactly?" She shook her head. She thinks he left something there that can ruin people. That sentence hit harder than it should have. I asked if Ethan was dead. She looked at me for a long moment and said no, but she didn't sound certain. She said he disappeared after sending one final message to Mara telling her not to let the unit get opened. After that, he stopped responding to calls. His phone went dead. His apartment was eventually emptied out. Nobody had seen him since. I opened the folder again and showed her the recorder and the notes. The second she saw the handwriting, her hand went to her mouth. "That's Mara," she said. That was when I knew the notes weren't random warnings from some anonymous stranger. They were instructions from a woman who had already been inside the unit, someone who had been trying to get to something before I sold it off piece by piece. I asked why she hadn't contacted the auction company or the police. She laughed once bitterly. Because if I start asking the wrong questions, they'll ask where Ethan is. That wasn't an answer, but it was close enough to one that I stopped pressing for the moment. I asked if there was anything in the unit that Ethan might have cared about enough to hide. She hesitated, then told me he used to work in records for a shipping company. Not glamorous, not exciting, just a quiet job where he had access to paperwork nobody else noticed. Then he started saying strange things about invoices, manifests, and containers that disappeared before they were logged properly. At first she thought he was stressed. Then he started collecting documents, copies, notes, receipts, printouts. He began storing everything in the unit. All of it, I asked. She nodded. He said if anything happened to him, that was where the truth would be. That was the first time I felt a real flicker of fear instead of confusion. Not because it sounded like a conspiracy theory, not because it sounded dramatic, because of how ordinary it sounded. The danger wasn't in some movie-style secret, it was in paperwork, receipts, file copies, little boring documents that most people would ignore. Those things were exactly the kind of evidence someone would spend a lot of time trying to bury. I asked if Mara had been helping him. She said she didn't know what he was doing, the mother replied, but I don't think I believe that. She then told me Mara had shown up twice after the unit was auctioned, asking whether anything had been removed from a brown box near the back wall. She was very specific about the box. Not the mattress, not the shelf, not the albums, the brown box. That was the same box I had almost ignored. I sat back and felt the full weight of how close I had come to tossing the important part into a dumpster. I asked the mother if she wanted the items back. She said yes immediately, then no, then yes again. The answer was clearly emotional, not practical. She wanted them, but she was scared of them too. I told her I had already looked through the box and that the albums, keys, recorder and notes were all still in my possession. She nodded like she'd expected that. Then she asked me something I didn't expect. Did you listen to the tape? I froze. I hadn't. I'd been too distracted by the papers and the notes, and honestly I had been avoiding the recorder because the whole thing already felt too intimate. But now the way she asked made it obvious the tape mattered. I said no. She looked relieved and terrified at the same time. Don't do it here, she said. I should have asked why. Instead I took the hint and told her I'd leave for the day and come back after I'd listened to it. She reached into a drawer, pulled out a photograph, and handed it to me before I left. It was Ethan and Mara together in front of the storage facility. Not taken recently, maybe a year old. They were standing beside a vehicle in the lot, both of them looking tense, like they had been arguing before someone took the picture. Ethan was holding a cardboard box. Mara had one hand on the door of the storage unit, and in the background, just barely visible, was another man standing near the office. The back of the photo had one word written on it. Proof. I drove home feeling like I had walked out of someone else's life by mistake. I didn't listen to the recorder right away. I sat on my couch for nearly an hour just turning it over in my hands. It was old enough that the battery cover barely stayed shut. There were scratches on the side, deep enough to suggest it had been dropped more than once. Finally, I pressed play. At first it was just static, then a burst of wind noise, then a man's voice, low and strained. Ethan. He sounded exhausted, like he had been talking for a long time already. The recording started with him saying he didn't know how much time he had left, and that if Mara was hearing this, then she had to assume the worst. He said the unit contained copies of manifests, photographs, and one notebook with names he had been told never to write down anywhere else. He said the shipping office had been moving containers off the books for months, maybe longer, and that he'd found enough to connect the pattern if anything happened to him. Then the recording cut abruptly. Not ended, cut. Like someone had stopped it. I hit replay and listened again. On the second pass, I heard something I had missed the first time. A door closing in the background. Then Mara's voice. Very quiet. Ethan, stop recording. My stomach dropped. The recording continued for another few seconds, but now the sound changed. There was rustling, a sharp breath, and then Ethan saying, "You shouldn't be here." Mara said, "Neither should he." Then another male voice, deeper this time, said, "Give me the box." After that there was a thud, and the recorder clicked off. I sat there in my apartment, so still I could hear the radiator hissing. There had been someone else in the unit. Not just Ethan, not just Mara. Someone had been there that night with them. And whatever was in the brown box had mattered enough for a third person to show up looking for it. That was the moment I understood the warning note in full. He still comes back, don't stay after dark. It wasn't warning me about Ethan returning. It was warning me about whoever came back for him. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about the photo, the tape, and the way Ethan's mother had told me not to listen there. By morning, I had convinced myself that the smartest thing to do was turn everything over to the police and wash my hands of it. That plan lasted exactly until I looked up the shipping company Ethan had worked for. Part 4. The company existed, but only just. Its website was barely more than a placeholder, and the contact number went straight to a voicemail that sounded like it had been recording for years. I dug through public records, business filings, old articles, anything I could find with the company name and Ethan's surname attached. What I found was enough to make my skin crawl, because the paperwork didn't show a criminal empire or anything cinematic. It showed a series of small, unexplained inconsistencies. Missing cargo, duplicate invoices. Containers listed under one route and delivered under another. Nothing dramatic on its own, but together it looked like a slow, careful leak. The kind that doesn't look like theft until someone finally adds it all up. That was probably the worst part. If I had found one obvious clue, I could have reported it and walked away. Instead, I had a pile of almosts, almost evidence, almost proof, almost enough to put a target on my back, but not enough to feel certain. So I did what any sane person would do. I called Mara. She answered on the second ring, like she had been waiting for the call. I told her who I was and that I had been to her mother's house. There was a pause so long I thought she might hang up, but instead she asked, very carefully, what I had found. I told her about the recorder, the notes, the photo, and the taped message. When I mentioned the third voice on the recording, she went quiet in a way that felt different from the silence on the other end of a normal phone call. This wasn't surprise, it was recognition. She said, "You listened to it." It wasn't a question. I asked who the third person was. She hesitated, then said, "If you're smart, you'll stop asking that." That was an excellent answer if her goal was to terrify me. I told her I wasn't trying to get involved, but I needed to know if there was any danger attached to the box. She laughed once without humor and asked if I really thought the danger came from the box. Then she said something that stuck with me. "The box is only a problem because people know it exists." I asked her what that meant. She said Ethan had copied everything. Not just notes, not just invoices. He had copied entire records onto cheap drives and hidden the backups inside the unit. He believed the shipping operation was laundering stolen goods through a series of off-book containers. He also believed someone inside the company was helping, maybe several people. He got scared when he realized he'd been noticed. That's when he started acting paranoid. That's when he started recording everything. That's when he asked Mara to help him move the important material out of the unit before he disappeared completely. I asked why they hadn't just gone to the police. She made a bitter sound and said, because by the time he figured it out, he didn't know who to trust. That made too much sense. Mara told me she had visited the unit after it was auctioned because she thought the brown box might still be there. She had used a copied access card Ethan had made for her months earlier. She knew the facility's routine, knew the blind spots in the cameras, knew exactly when the office was empty. She admitted she had gone in at night, not to steal, but to check whether the contents were still intact. Then she asked me the question I had been avoiding myself. What did you do with the drives? I told her I hadn't found any drives. That was the truth. The box contained the albums, recorder, keys, notes, and a few loose papers, but nothing else. She swore under her breath and said the drives had to be somewhere in the unit or had already been taken before the auction listing went live. That's when I realized the unit had probably been disturbed more than once. Not by me. Before me. I went back through the items one by one and found a false bottom in the box lid. It was thin, almost invisible, and I only noticed it because one corner felt looser than the others. Prying it open revealed a flat envelope tucked into the cavity. Inside were 2 microSD cards and a folded sheet with a list of dates and names. At the top of the page was one line. If I'm missing, give this to the right person. If I'm dead, don't trust the first one who asks for it. No signature, just that. I took the envelope to Mara's mother the next day because I couldn't think of anything better to do. The second she saw the cards, she sat down hard in a kitchen chair and covered her face with both hands. That was the first time I saw her cry. She told me Ethan had made her memorize the names on the page in case anything happened. Some of the names belonged to people he worked with, some belonged to drivers, some were private contractors. One was a woman from accounting. The last 2 names were crossed out, then written again, then crossed out again so heavily the paper was nearly torn through. I asked who they were. She looked up at me and said, "The ones who visited after midnight." That was as much as I got. She wouldn't say more, and I didn't push. By then I had enough to know the story was bigger than my random auction purchase, and probably bigger than whatever moral line I thought I was standing on. The next morning, the facility manager called me and asked, very politely, if I could come sign a statement about the unauthorized access. He sounded nervous enough that I almost refused on principle, but I wanted one last look at the unit before I did anything else. The moment I arrived, I knew something had changed. The roll-up door was sealed with a bright red lock tag, and there were 2 local police cars parked near the office. Not the dramatic kind with flashing lights, just cars, quiet, official. The manager met me halfway across the lot and looked like he hadn't slept in days. He whispered that someone had broken into the unit overnight. Not me, not Mara, someone else. He said the brown box had been opened, the shelf had been moved, and one of the walls had fresh scrape marks, as if someone had been searching for something hidden behind the paneling. I asked if the police had taken the contents. He shook his head. They're still inside. That made no sense until he told me the officers wanted to keep the unit closed until they finished documenting it. I asked whether they knew about the records. He looked uncomfortable and said one of the officers had already taken photos of the paperwork and that a detective would be reaching out soon. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt sick. Because if the police were now involved, that meant the story had moved from strange to dangerous. It also meant somebody else had probably realized the box was still in play. When I got home, there was another note waiting in my mailbox. No envelope, just a folded piece of paper shoved through the slot. It said, "You took the wrong thing." At the bottom, in much smaller writing, there was one more line. They watched the auction. I stood in my hallway holding that note for so long my hand started to cramp. And then my phone rang. The number was blocked. I answered without thinking. Nobody spoke at first, just breathing. Then a man's voice, calm and low, said, "If you want to stay out of this, bring the cards tomorrow night." I asked who he was. He said, "The person who made sure the unit was empty before you bought it." Then the line went dead. I didn't go to bed that night. I sat in my kitchen with the cards on the table and the note beside them, trying to decide whether I was being threatened, baited, or both. By then I understood one thing very clearly. The storage unit had never been abandoned. It had been paused, hidden, managed, and I had stumbled into the middle of whatever story Ethan had been trying to bury. The more I thought about the phone call, the more it bothered me that the man had said he made sure the unit was empty before I bought it. Not cleared out, not processed, empty. That sounded deliberate, like someone had checked the unit after Ethan disappeared and removed anything too dangerous to leave behind, but missed the false bottom box. Or maybe they hadn't missed it. Maybe they had left it on purpose. I called Mara back around sunrise. She answered on the first ring this time, which told me she hadn't slept either. I asked if she'd gotten a threatening call. She said no. Then I told her about the note and the anonymous voice. Her tone changed immediately. She told me not to give anyone the cards, not the police, not the facility, not anyone who asked casually. I asked why. She said, because the first person to ask for them probably isn't the person you need to trust. That was about as reassuring as a locked door in a burning house. She told me she had finally found a contact who believed Ethan had uncovered a real chain of fraud, not just a messy internal accounting issue. The shipping company had been using a network of shell deliveries to move stolen product through the system, then relabeling it before it reached final distribution. Ethan hadn't just found a few bad invoices. He'd found a pattern that connected warehouse staff, drivers, and someone in the office who signed off on everything. I asked if she had names. She said yes, but wouldn't raid them over the phone. Then she told me to meet her in a public place with the cards, because whatever happened next needed to be done fast. I almost said no, not because I didn't want to help, but because every instinct I had was screaming that I was the easiest person in this entire chain to sacrifice. I was the random auction buyer, the guy with no connection to Ethan except bad luck. If things got ugly, nobody would remember my name. Still, I went. We met at a diner just off the highway, one of those places that serves eggs all day and smells faintly like burnt coffee and old vinyl. Mara looked exactly how someone looks after carrying a secret for too long, tired, angry, and determined in a way that didn't leave room for hesitation. I handed her the envelope. She checked the cards, then slid them into her bag like she was moving evidence, not electronics. Then she told me something I had not expected. Her brother was alive. Or at least he had been 2 nights earlier. She said she had received a message from an encrypted account with a single sentence. The box was compromised. No signature, no extra details, but the timestamp matched the night the unit had been broken into. I asked why she hadn't told anyone. She gave me a look that said I was being naive on purpose. Because if he's still using that account, then someone else might be watching it too. That was the moment I realized Ethan might not have disappeared the way everyone thought. He might have vanished because he had to. Mara explained that the man on the phone, the one who claimed he made sure the unit was empty, was likely connected to the company's security or logistics side. Maybe not the head of it, but close enough to know the facility auction process and to intervene if necessary. If he believed I had the cards, then he was already trying to close whatever gap Ethan had opened. I asked what we were supposed to do now. She said we make noise. Not the reckless kind, the document kind, the public kind, the kind that makes people deny things in writing. Her plan was simple, if terrifying. She wanted to send copies of the records to a journalist she trusted, a lawyer she knew through a former classmate, and one investigative contact who had previously reported on cargo fraud in the region. She said the point wasn't to solve everything overnight. The point was to make it expensive to keep hiding. I told her that sounded like it could get her killed. She answered it already did. She said it quietly, like she'd said it to herself before. That was the first time I understood that Ethan wasn't the only person who had been living with fear. Mara had been carrying the aftermath for months, probably longer. She had been sneaking into a storage unit at night because she believed the only copy of the truth might still be sitting under a layer of dust in a forgotten metal box. I gave her the recorder too. She asked me to play it one more time before she left, just to be sure we hadn't missed anything. We listened together in the diner booth with our heads close to the cheap little speaker. The tape hissed, crackled, and then Ethan's voice came through again. But this time near the end, we caught something neither of us had focused on before. Right after the thud and the cutoff, right before the tape died, there was another sound in the background. A familiar one. The beeping of a keypad. Not the storage gate, a phone, or a security door. Mara stared at me. That's from the office, she said. Which meant the third man had not just shown up at the unit. He had come from the facility side, or from a place with similar access. That narrowed the circle enough to make the whole thing feel suddenly sharper and more dangerous. We left the diner separately. She said she would contact the journalist by noon. I told her I would keep my phone on and not answer unknown numbers. She smiled a little at that, but it didn't reach her eyes. 2 hours later, I got one more message from the blocked number. It contained a photo. The photo was taken outside my apartment building, and it showed my front door. Something small and square had been tucked into the frame on the floor. A card. The exact kind of card I had just handed to Mara. Under the photo, there was only one line. You were not supposed to keep a copy. I called the police this time. I told them everything I knew, not the full truth because I still didn't have it, but enough to force a report. Enough to make them log the threats, the break-in, the storage unit, and the phone call. I don't know whether they believed me, but I knew if I stayed quiet I would end up with nothing but fear and a very expensive storage auction mistake. By evening, officers were at the facility again. By the next morning, the story had spread far enough that the shipping company started issuing denials. And by the following week, Ethan's name started appearing in places it had not been before. That part matters because the whole reason I'm telling this story is not that I bought a weird storage unit and found some creepy notes. It's that a stupid auction purchase accidentally helped expose a chain of lies that had been buried for a long time. Ethan's records forced someone to answer questions they had hoped no one would ask. Mara got her brother's trail out into the open, and the company couldn't hide behind lost paperwork anymore. As for me, I sold nothing from that unit. I kept the albums long enough to hand them over properly. The facility compensated me for the unauthorized access, and the police eventually returned the original lock hardware as evidence. The last time I heard from Mara, she said they had traced the missing container records far enough to open a formal investigation. She also told me they still hadn't found Ethan. So maybe the story doesn't end with a neat answer. Maybe it ends with a warning. Because every once in a while, I still think about that first mug being warm in my hand, like somebody had just set it down. I think about the note hidden inside it. I think about the unit sitting there in the dark for years, holding a truth that somebody kept trying to collect. And I think about the man on the phone who said he had made sure the unit was empty before I bought it. That's the part that stays with me. Not the auction. Not the boxes. The certainty that someone watched the listing, waited for the sale, and hoped the right thing would vanish before I ever opened the door. And for a while, they almost got away with it.